One film convinced audiences that a man could fly. The next dared to ask whether a young woman could carry that same impossible hope. In the years after Superman transformed superhero cinema forever, expectations were no longer simply high, they were monumental. Christopher Reeve's portrayal had become the gold standard for cinematic heroism, leaving behind a cultural landscape where every new cape would be measured against an almost mythical benchmark. Yet instead of delivering another familiar story of skyscrapers, scientific genius and world-ending technology, DC made a decision that still feels surprisingly bold. It stepped away from the reassuring certainty of Superman's world and plunged headfirst into fantasy. Gone were the sleek machines and cosmic threats that defined Krypton's surviving sun. In their place came enchanted artifacts, ancient magic, mysterious dimensions, and an isolated civilization fighting to preserve its existence against impossible odds. Argo City was not merely another location within the Superman mythos. It felt like a forgotten fairy kingdom drifting through space, where wonder replaced realism and mythology quietly overshadowed science. Even the conflict itself reflected that transformation. Instead of battling a criminal mastermind obsessed with power or profit, Kara Zor-El would face forces rooted in temptation, sorcery, and desire. It was less a traditional superhero adventure than a modern fairy tale wearing a cape. For audiences expecting another Superman, the shift was almost disorienting. The familiar rules had vanished. Flying still inspired awe, but now it existed beside magical rituals, enchanted shadows, and villains whose greatest weapon was manipulation rather than technology. Looking back, it almost resembles two entirely different cinematic eras colliding inside the same universe. One celebrated science fiction's optimistic future, the other embraced timeless fantasy, where emotion often proved stronger than logic. Perhaps that collision explains why Supergirl became one of the most misunderstood comic book films of its decade. History often remembers it as an expensive disappointment, a forgotten footnote trapped between larger superhero milestones. But that reputation tells only part of the story. Beneath its uneven execution lies an unusually ambitious experiment, one willing to expand the mythology instead of simply repeating what had already worked. At a time when sequels typically promised audiences more of the same, Supergirl risked becoming something entirely different. Yet another question lingers beneath every conversation about the film, one far more revealing than box office numbers or critical reviews. Was the world truly prepared to embrace a female superhero carrying the weight of an iconic legacy in 1984? Kara wasn't replacing Superman, but she inevitably lived in his shadow, expected to prove herself while constantly inviting comparison to a cultural phenomenon almost impossible to match. That burden became part of the audience's experience as much as the character's own journey. Decades later, the conversation has changed. What once seemed like a misguided detour increasingly resembles a fascinating creative gamble, filled with ideas that modern superhero storytelling would later revisit with far greater confidence. And as Kara Zor-El continues to evolve across animation, comics, and new cinematic interpretations, the film that many dismissed refuses to disappear, inviting us to reconsider whether it failed because it misunderstood its moment, or because its moment simply hadn't arrived yet. To understand why Supergirl continues to inspire debate, we have to look far beyond the reputation that followed its release. This isn't simply the story of a film that struggled at the box office. It's the story of an ambitious creative gamble caught between changing audience expectations, studio ambitions, and a superhero genre that had not yet learned how many different forms it could take. Every chapter of its history reveals another layer, and each one helps explain why this overlooked adventure has quietly become more interesting with age. We'll begin where every extraordinary production truly starts, behind the camera. Long before Kara Zor-El ever took flight, The project was already navigating enormous expectations. The Salkin brothers, whose names had become inseparable from Superman's cinematic success, believed the universe could expand beyond its most famous hero. That decision would trigger an ambitious production filled with difficult creative choices, shifting priorities, and casting decisions that shaped the film long before audiences ever bought a ticket. The journey from concept to screen proved almost as dramatic as anything shown within the finished movie itself. From there, we'll step inside the film and examine the story on its own terms rather than through decades of inherited criticism. Instead of asking whether it duplicated Superman, we'll explore why it deliberately chose another direction. We'll break apart Kara's emotional journey, uncover the symbolism hidden within Argo City, examine the unusual blend of science fiction and fantasy, and look at how themes of responsibility, identity, temptation, and self discovery quietly drive every major turning point. Even the visual language, from glowing environments to magical imagery, reveals ideas that deserve far more attention than they usually receive. But the conversation doesn't end when the credits roll. Kara Zor-El refused to remain trapped inside a single interpretation. Across decades of animation, from the beloved DC animated universe to the Tomorrowverse, each generation has rediscovered something different about the character. Sometimes she is portrayed as an optimistic newcomer, sometimes as a survivor carrying unimaginable trauma, and sometimes as a warrior searching for purpose in an unfamiliar world. Together, these evolving portrayals reveal how remarkably flexible the character has always been, even when the 1984 film was judged far more harshly than the ideas it introduced. Perhaps that's why revisiting Supergirl feels especially meaningful today. Modern superhero cinema is overflowing with interconnected universes, multiversal stakes, and familiar origin stories. Yet audiences increasingly gravitate toward heroes whose greatest battles are personal rather than cosmic. Kiara's search for an identity separate from her legendary cousin speaks directly to that desire. Her struggle isn't simply about learning to use extraordinary powers, it's about proving that a legacy can inspire without defining an entire life. That question has only become more relevant with time, making this forgotten chapter of superhero history feel unexpectedly modern the closer we examine it. For many people, Supergirl wasn't discovered in a crowded theater or through glowing reviews. It appeared much later, almost by accident. Maybe it was hiding on a worn VHS cassette at the local rental store, its colorful cover promising an adventure that somehow escaped the spotlight. Maybe it surfaced during a late night cable broadcast, beginning halfway through just as someone with impossibly bright powers soared across the screen. Long before streaming libraries placed thousands of titles within easy reach, forgotten movies had a strange kind of magic. You didn't choose them because the internet recommended them. You found them because curiosity won. That sense of discovery became part of the experience itself. The opening notes of its synth-infused orchestral score immediately transported viewers into a distinctly 1980s vision of heroism, where wonder mattered more than realism. Every glowing artifact seemed capable of unlocking another hidden mystery. Every burst of magical light hinted at a universe much larger than the story could fully explain. Even the flying effects, created with techniques that now reveal their age, carried an unmistakable sincerity. They weren't trying to convince audiences that superheroes existed. They were inviting audiences to believe they could, if only for a couple of hours. At the center of all that spectacle stood Helen Slater, whose performance remains one of the film's greatest strengths. Rather than attempting to imitate Superman, she gave Kara an entirely different emotional rhythm. There was excitement in her curiosity, uncertainty in her confidence, and warmth beneath every awkward mistake. She wasn't introduced as a perfect hero descending from the heavens. She felt like someone discovering who she wanted to become while carrying expectations she never asked to inherit. That quiet humanity is often what stays with viewers long after individual scenes begin to fade. Perhaps that's why Kara's journey resonates on a surprisingly personal level. Most people know what it feels like to be compared with someone else, a successful sibling, a talented parent, a respected mentor, or simply the person everyone assumes you'll become. Living in the shadow of another person's reputation can make every achievement feel smaller and every mistake feel larger. Kara's greatest challenge isn't proving that she possesses extraordinary abilities. It's proving that her identity has value independent of the symbol already standing above her. That's an emotional conflict almost anyone can recognize, whether superheroes exist or not. And if you've somehow skipped this unusual chapter of DC history, you are missing one of its most fascinating experiments. Supergirl isn't memorable because it followed the safest path. It's memorable because it wandered somewhere stranger, embracing fantasy, emotion, and unapologetic optimism at a time when few superhero films were willing to take those risks. That eccentric spirit continues to set it apart, inviting every new generation to discover a cinematic detour that feels unlike almost anything else the genre has produced. The deeper you look into Supergirl, the more obvious it becomes that the film was never conceived as a simple side story. It emerged from a moment when superhero cinema was still writing its own rulebook. The enormous success of Superman in 1978 had done more than create a blockbuster. It convinced audiences that comic book mythology could be treated with sincerity, scale, and emotional weight. For producers Alexander and Elias Salkind, that success naturally inspired a bigger question. If one Kryptonian hero could capture the world's imagination, why couldn't that universe grow beyond a single legendary figure?
That ambition arrived during a period of transition. By the time Supergirl entered development, the Superman franchise had already evolved through multiple creative directions. Spectacle remained essential, but repeating the same formula risked diminishing the sense of discovery that had made the original film so extraordinary. Expanding the mythology offered an opportunity to explore corners of the DC universe that audiences had never seen on the big screen. Rather than introducing another variation of Superman's familiar journey, the filmmakers searched for a story that would immediately establish its own personality. That search gradually pushed the project away from pure science fiction and towards something much more unusual. While Superman's adventures largely grounded their conflicts in advanced technology, alien civilizations, and larger-than-life criminal schemes, Kara Zor-El's world embraced fantasy with surprising confidence. Ancient magic, mystical artifacts, enchanted landscapes, and supernatural villains became central ingredients instead of occasional curiosities. It was a bold tonal shift that separated Supergirl from its cinematic predecessor almost immediately. Instead of asking how science might explain extraordinary events, the film often accepted mystery as part of its emotional language. This creative decision wasn't simply about changing visual aesthetics. It reflected a different understanding of heroism. Superman often represented certainty, confidence, and almost mythic moral clarity. Kara's journey invited vulnerability, curiosity, and personal growth. The fantasy framework allowed emotional challenges to take physical form, turning temptation, fear, and uncertainty into tangible obstacles rather than abstract ideas. In many ways, the production was attempting something audiences would later recognize as common within modern superhero storytelling, allowing different heroes from the same universe to inhabit completely different genres. Of course, none of those ambitions mattered unless the filmmakers found someone capable of carrying the entire production. Casting Kara Zor-El became one of the project's most important decisions, and the search was remarkably extensive. Hundreds of young actresses auditioned, each bringing her own interpretation of the iconic character. The role demanded far more than physical resemblance to a comic book heroine. Whoever stepped into the cape needed to project innocence without appearing naive, confidence without arrogance, and determination without losing the warmth that made Kara distinct from her famous cousin. Helen Slater ultimately emerged as the choice that united those qualities. Although she was relatively unknown at the time, her screen presence immediately suggested someone who could balance extraordinary abilities with genuine emotional accessibility. She didn't approach Kara as a flawless icon descending from another world. Instead, she emphasized the excitement, uncertainty, and optimism of someone discovering both a new planet and a new version of herself simultaneously. That interpretation gave the character an approachable humanity that remained visible even during the film's largest fantasy sequences. Choosing an emerging actress for the lead also created another challenge. A production of this scale needed recognizable names capable of attracting audiences while reinforcing the film's credibility. The solution was to surround its new star with performers whose reputations carried enormous dramatic weight. Peter O'Toole joined the cast, bringing decades of theatrical prestige and unmistakable screen authority. His presence immediately elevated scenes that might otherwise have functioned only as exposition, adding a sense of classical grandeur that complemented the film's mythological ambitions. Faye Dunaway provided a different kind of energy altogether. Already celebrated for commanding performances across multiple genres, she transformed the film's central antagonist into a memorable blend of theatrical excess and genuine menace. Rather than presenting evil as purely physical domination, her performance leaned into vanity, ambition, manipulation, and desire for control. Within a story increasingly shaped by fantasy, that heightened style felt entirely appropriate, embracing larger-than-life emotion instead of restrained realism. Together, these casting decisions revealed the production's larger philosophy. Supergirl wasn't trying to imitate the exact chemistry of the Superman films. It wanted its own identity, combining an inexperienced but charismatic heroine with veteran performers capable of giving the surrounding world dramatic texture. The contrast mirrored Kara's own narrative position, placing a young protagonist among figures who seemed wiser, older, and infinitely more experienced. Behind the scenes, however, the path from script to screen remained anything but straightforward. Creative ideas evolved, priorities shifted, and different visions competed to define exactly what Supergirl should become. The filmmakers were attempting to balance audience expectations, franchise continuity, fantasy storytelling, and commercial appeal all at once, a combination that made every major decision more complicated than it first appeared. Those competing ambitions would ultimately shape not only the film's distinctive personality but also many of the strengths and contradictions that continue to fuel discussion decades later. By the time Supergirl approached its release, Hollywood was no longer standing in the same place it had occupied when Superman first astonished audiences in 1978. The cinematic landscape had changed remarkably quickly. Blockbusters had become bigger, competition had intensified, and viewers were developing increasingly specific expectations about what spectacle should look and feel like. The superhero genre itself was still in its infancy, but audience tastes were already evolving, creating a surprisingly uncertain environment for any film attempting to expand an established franchise. That uncertainty was impossible to separate from the recent history of the Superman series. While the original film had become a cultural milestone and its immediate successor maintained much of that momentum, Superman 3 received a far more mixed response. Its lighter tone, stronger emphasis on comedy, and shifting priorities divided audiences who had fallen in love with the sense of grandeur that defined Christopher Reeve's earliest adventures. Although the character remained enormously popular, the franchise no longer carried the same aura of invincibility. For the first time, there were genuine questions about where this cinematic universe should go next. Those questions inevitably shaped expectations surrounding Supergirl. Rather than arriving as an entirely independent production, it carried the burden of proving that the world established by Superman could support another central hero without feeling repetitive. Studios hoped the film would broaden the appeal of the franchise while introducing a fresh perspective capable of attracting new viewers. Expanding beyond a single iconic protagonist seemed like a logical creative step, but it also represented a commercial gamble. Audiences had embraced Superman because he felt singular. Convincing them to invest emotionally in another Kryptonian required more than familiar costumes and shared mythology. The marketing campaign reflected that ambition. Promotional material introduced Kara Zor-El as a new kind of hero while maintaining clear visual connections to the Superman legacy that audiences already recognized. Posters emphasized flight, wonder, and the unmistakable symbol associated with Krypton, reassuring longtime fans that this adventure belonged within the same broader universe. At the same time, advertisements highlighted brighter colors, magical imagery, and youthful optimism, signaling that this would not simply be another retelling of Superman's story. The campaign also reached aggressively toward younger audiences and comic book readers, presenting Supergirl as an exciting fantasy adventure filled with imagination rather than a continuation aimed exclusively at existing Superman fans. That approach made sense within the entertainment culture of the mid-1980s. Family-oriented fantasy films were flourishing, offering audiences enchanted worlds populated by extraordinary heroes, mystical objects, and unforgettable villains. Escapism remained one of cinema's greatest attractions, and Kara's story appeared perfectly positioned to embrace that appetite for wonder. Yet this strategy introduced an unexpected challenge. The very qualities designed to distinguish Supergirl also made it harder to categorize. Was it primarily a superhero movie? A fantasy adventure? A coming-of-age story? Or something attempting to combine all three? Modern audiences are accustomed to superhero films borrowing freely from science fiction, horror, political thrillers, and mythology, but in 1984 that kind of genre blending felt far less familiar. Viewers often entered theaters carrying assumptions shaped almost entirely by Superman, only to encounter a film operating according to noticeably different emotional rules. That difference became immediately visible through the film's aesthetic choices. Instead of grounding every extraordinary event in futuristic technology or alien science, Supergirl embraced glowing magical artifacts, enchanted landscapes, mysterious rituals, and supernatural forces with remarkable confidence. Its world often resembled a fairy tale unfolding across cosmic space rather than a traditional science fiction epic. The imagery invited audiences to experience mystery instead of demanding rational explanation, creating a tone that separated the film from nearly every major superhero production that had come before it. For some viewers, that bold shift felt refreshing. It suggested that comic book cinema possessed creative possibilities extending far beyond familiar formulas. Others found the transition unexpectedly jarring. Having associated the Superman universe with scientific optimism and larger-than-life heroics, they struggled to reconcile witches, sorcery, and fantasy symbolism with the cinematic language they expected from Kryptonian stories. The disconnect wasn't necessarily about quality. It was about expectation. Audiences often judge a film not only by what it is, but by what they anticipated it would become before the lights dimmed. The broader atmosphere of the 1980s amplified that tension. Popular entertainment frequently celebrated heightened performances, vibrant production design, theatrical villains, and unapologetically stylized storytelling. Camp, fantasy, and spectacle comfortably coexisted across many successful films of the decade. Yet superhero cinema occupied a more uncertain position. Because the genre had produced relatively few large-scale theatrical successes, there were no firmly established conventions explaining how far these stories could stretch before audiences resisted. Supergirl ventured confidently into territory that the genre itself had not fully defined. Looking back, it's striking how many creative choices that once appeared unusual would later become common. Contemporary superhero films regularly weave mythology, magic, alternate dimensions, and emotional allegory into narratives that audiences accept almost effortlessly. In many respects, Supergirl anticipated that broader creative freedom years before the genre was ready to embrace it. The film wasn't merely competing against other releases of its era, it was also competing against assumptions about what superhero stories were supposed to be. That made its release more than the debut of another comic book adaptation. It became an experiment testing whether audiences would follow a familiar symbol into an unfamiliar world. The answer proved far more complicated than anyone expected, because the challenge facing Supergirl extended beyond marketing or box office expectations. It was attempting to redefine the boundaries of superhero storytelling at a moment when those boundaries still seemed surprisingly rigid. Before Supergirl introduces its heroine to Earth, it asks audiences to leave behind everything they think they know about Krypton's legacy. Instead of beginning among familiar city streets or recognizable landmarks, the film opens within Argo City, an extraordinary sanctuary hidden inside an isolated inner space continuum. It's a place that exists because survival demanded imagination. While Krypton itself has long since been destroyed, this remarkable enclave escaped annihilation by preserving a fragment of its civilization beyond the reach of the catastrophe. The result is one of the most visually distinctive settings ever introduced in early superhero cinema. Argo City immediately separates itself from the industrial grandeur often associated with science fiction. Its architecture is luminous rather than mechanical, dominated by crystalline structures that seem to glow from within instead of relying on visible technology. Towers rise with elegant curves instead of harsh angles. Transparent surfaces scatter light across every environment, giving the city an almost dreamlike quality. Rather than suggesting cold technological superiority, the design evokes harmony, serenity, and balance. It feels less like an advanced metropolis and more like a living work of art suspended outside conventional reality. That artistic approach quietly communicates something essential about the people who inhabit it. Argo City isn't defined by conquest, expansion, or military strength. It is a civilization dedicated to preservation. Every shimmering structure reflects a society that has survived unimaginable loss by protecting its remaining culture rather than rebuilding an empire. Unlike many fictional survivors who become hardened by catastrophe, these Kryptonians maintain dignity, education, and compassion. Their world carries the melancholy of exile, but it refuses to surrender its sense of hope. At the heart of this peaceful community is Kara Zor-El, introduced not as an invincible icon but as a young woman filled with curiosity and optimism. Helen Slater's performance immediately establishes an important distinction between Kara and her famous cousin. Superman often arrives with quiet confidence, already understanding the immense responsibility placed upon his shoulders. Kara, by contrast, still possesses the excitement of someone discovering her own potential. She observes the world with open wonder, asks questions without embarrassment, and approaches challenges with enthusiasm rather than certainty. These qualities make her feel approachable long before she performs any extraordinary feat. That youthful energy also reveals the emotional foundation of her character. Kara isn't driven by destiny alone. She genuinely wants to contribute to the community that raised her. Her optimism isn't naive because she ignores danger. It's rooted in trust, believing that knowledge, kindness, and courage can overcome uncertainty. This outlook becomes especially significant because the film's central conflict doesn't emerge from deliberate malice within Argo City. Instead, disaster grows from good intentions mixed with dangerous overconfidence. That brings us to Zalter, Kara's mentor and one of the story's most fascinating figures. He embodies the classic archetype of the visionary whose imagination often outruns his judgment. Intelligent, inventive, and endlessly fascinated by possibility, Zalter believes discovery requires risk. His curiosity has undoubtedly contributed to Argo City's survival, yet the same restless ambition also prevents him from respecting every boundary placed before him. He isn't portrayed as reckless for the sake of excitement. Rather, he represents the timeless temptation faced by innovators who become convinced that understanding the rules also grants permission to bend them. Nothing illustrates that temptation more clearly than the omegahedron. Within the mythology of Supergirl, this extraordinary object serves as the city's essential power source, sustaining the fragile sanctuary that has protected Krypton's surviving citizens for generations. Visually, it radiates with an almost mystical brilliance, reinforcing the film's unusual fusion of advanced civilization and fantasy symbolism. The omegahedron isn't presented as a machine with visible mechanisms or technical explanations. Instead, it functions almost like a sacred relic, an object whose immense power inspires both reverence and caution. Symbolically, the omegahedron represents far more than energy. It is the physical embodiment of Argo City's future. Every glowing surface, every peaceful street, and every surviving memory of Krypton depends upon its continued presence. By concentrating the city's survival into a single object, the film creates immediate dramatic tension. Viewers instinctively understand that anything capable of sustaining an entire civilization also carries unimaginable consequences if placed in the wrong hands. Long before the plot accelerates, the omegahedron becomes a quiet reminder that even the most beautiful worlds can rest upon fragile foundations. Zalter, however, sees possibilities beyond preservation. Believing he can momentarily harness the omegahedron's incredible power for experimentation, he secretly removes it from its protected chamber. His intentions are not selfish in the conventional sense. He seeks knowledge, convinced that his understanding is sufficient to control forces others treat with caution. Yet the scene reflects one of the oldest themes in mythology and science fiction alike. Intelligence without restraint often creates the very disaster it hopes to prevent. The experiment quickly escapes his control. In an instant, confidence gives way to panic as the omegahedron slips free, breaking loose from the secure environment that has contained it for generations. The sequence unfolds with surprising urgency, transforming Argos City's tranquil atmosphere into one of mounting desperation. Citizens watch helplessly as the object sustaining their entire existence drifts beyond reach, moving farther away despite every effort to recover it. The calm elegance that defined the opening moments is suddenly replaced by the terrifying realization that survival itself has become uncertain. Visually, the escaping omegahedron carries profound symbolic weight. Its glowing journey through the vast darkness resembles more than a physical accident. It feels like destiny leaving one world in search of another. The object literally crosses the boundary between isolated civilizations, linking Kara's protected home to an unfamiliar planet she has never imagined visiting. In narrative terms, the moment functions as the true beginning of her adventure. Everything she has known is slipping away alongside the city's most precious treasure. For Kara, the crisis becomes deeply personal. Recovering the omegahedron is no longer simply a mission assigned by others. It is an act of responsibility toward the people who gave her a home, an opportunity to prove that courage means acting when fear would be easier. The decision she makes in response reveals the defining quality of her character. She doesn't chase glory or adventure for its own sake. She chooses sacrifice because protecting others matters more than preserving her own comfort. With the omegahedron disappearing into the unknown and Argos City's future hanging in the balance, the sheltered world that shaped Kara Zor-El can no longer contain her. Beyond the boundaries of her luminous sanctuary lies a planet completely unprepared for the extraordinary visitor now racing toward it, carrying not only the hopes of a forgotten civilization but the first true test of the hero she has yet to become. The loss of the omegahedron transforms Argos City's quiet existence into a race against time, but what truly defines this turning point is Kara's response. No council orders her to leave. No prophecy names her as the chosen savior. The decision comes from within. Faced with the possibility that her home could slowly fade into darkness, she chooses the one path no one else is willing to take. It is an act driven not by certainty of success, but by acceptance of responsibility. In that single choice, Kara begins the journey from gifted citizen to genuine hero. The portal leading beyond Argos City is more than a passage through space. It represents the complete abandonment of everything familiar. Until now, Kara has lived in a protected environment shaped by order, knowledge, and community. Stepping into the unknown means surrendering every guarantee that has defined her life. The sequence captures a universal emotional truth. Every meaningful transformation begins with a leap taken before all the answers exist. Heroism rarely starts with confidence. More often, it begins with courage outweighing fear for just long enough to move forward. Visually, the transition is one of the film's most imaginative moments. Instead of presenting space as an endless void filled only with stars and planets, Supergirl embraces a dreamlike interpretation of interdimensional travel. Light bends, colors shift, and reality itself seems fluid, reinforcing the film's willingness to blur the line between science fiction and fantasy. The journey feels almost spiritual rather than technological, suggesting that Kara is crossing not only physical distance but also the boundary between childhood and adulthood, dependence and independence, certainty and self-discovery. When she finally reaches Earth, the change is immediate and profound. Earth's yellow sun awakens abilities that had remained dormant within her Kryptonian biology. Flight comes naturally, but so do incredible strength, speed, heightened senses, and resilience beyond human imagination. Unlike many superhero origin stories that focus on painful experimentation or reluctant acceptance, Kara experiences her powers with genuine wonder. She laughs, explores, and learns through movement, treating each new discovery as another reason to embrace the unfamiliar world surrounding her. These moments reveal something essential about her personality. Kara does not see power as a burden before she sees it as a gift. Her first instinct is curiosity rather than fear. She isn't consumed by anxiety over what she might become. Instead, she approaches her abilities with the excitement of an artist discovering entirely new ways to express herself. That emotional perspective gives the film a lighter rhythm than many superhero narratives. Extraordinary powers are not immediately tied to tragedy, they become extensions of Kara's hopeful spirit. The film subtly reminds us that before becoming Earth's newest protector, Kara is simply a creative young woman searching for her place in an unfamiliar world. Her artistic temperament influences the way she observes her surroundings. She notices beauty before danger, possibility before conflict. That outlook distinguishes her from heroes defined primarily by duty or discipline. Kara's optimism is not ignorance. It is a conscious openness to experience, allowing audiences to discover Earth through fresh eyes alongside her. Of course, surviving on an alien planet requires more than extraordinary abilities. Kara quickly realizes that blending into human society demands an identity that conceals her true origins. This necessity introduces one of the oldest traditions in superhero mythology, the creation of an alter ego. Rather than walking openly through the world as Kara Zor-El, she adopts the name Linda Lee, stepping into a life that appears ordinary on the surface while quietly hiding unimaginable potential beneath it. The choice of Linda Lee carries symbolic importance beyond simple disguise. It represents Kara's willingness to participate in humanity rather than merely observe it. Instead of remaining isolated above the world she has entered, she chooses to become part of its everyday rhythms. Enrolling at Midvale Academy allows her to experience friendships, routines, awkward introductions, and personal growth that no amount of superhuman strength could replace. In many ways, this decision reflects the same philosophy that has long defined the best superhero stories. Extraordinary abilities matter most when they remain connected to ordinary human experiences. Midvale itself becomes a fascinating contrast to Argo City. The crystalline perfection of Kara's home gives way to classrooms, neighborhoods, and social interactions shaped by imperfection. Human life feels chaotic, unpredictable, and occasionally confusing. Yet that very unpredictability is what makes Earth worth protecting. The film gently suggests that beauty does not exist only in flawless civilizations. It can also be found in ordinary people navigating imperfect lives with resilience and hope. As Kara adapts to her new surroundings, another story quietly unfolds elsewhere. Unlike Kara, who enters Earth motivated by selflessness, someone else encounters the Omegahedron through entirely different circumstances. Selena, an ambitious woman fascinated by the occult, unexpectedly discovers the mysterious object without fully understanding its origins. For her, the glowing artifact is not a symbol of responsibility or survival. It is an opportunity. This encounter dramatically alters the balance of power within the narrative. Until this moment, Selena's interest in magic exists largely within the realm of ritual, belief, and aspiration. She seeks supernatural influence but lacks the genuine force necessary to transform those ambitions into reality. The Omegahedron changes everything. Its extraordinary energy amplifies her abilities, turning symbolic practices into authentic magical power. The difference is immediate. What once resembled illusion begins to produce tangible consequences. This contrast between Kara and Selena forms the emotional foundation of the film's central conflict. Both women are transformed by the same object, yet each responds according to her deepest values. Kara receives incredible powers and instinctively thinks about protecting others. Selena gains unimaginable magical potential and immediately sees a path toward personal domination. The omegahedron itself remains morally neutral. It simply magnifies the character of whoever possesses it. In that sense, the true battle is never about the artifact alone. It is about the intentions carried by the hands that hold it. The film also reinforces its unusual commitment to fantasy through Selena's growing influence. Rather than introducing another technologically advanced villain to mirror Superman's adversaries, Supergirl embraces enchanted spells, mystical symbols, and supernatural manipulation. This creative decision broadens the emotional vocabulary of the story. Kara's challenges will not always be solved through strength or speed alone. She is entering a world where belief, temptation, and imagination can become as dangerous as any physical opponent. By the end of this opening movement, Kara has crossed far more than the distance between two worlds. She has accepted a new identity, discovered extraordinary abilities, and unknowingly entered a conflict already taking shape beyond her awareness. While Linda Lee begins building a life among ordinary people, the stolen heart of Argo City is awakening powers that threaten to reshape Earth itself, drawing two vastly different women toward a collision neither yet realizes is inevitable. One of the most unusual qualities of Supergirl is how comfortably it shifts between everyday adolescence and mythic fantasy without treating either as less important. After arriving on Earth, Kara's greatest challenge is not immediately defeating an unstoppable enemy. Instead, she must learn how to exist among ordinary people while hiding an extraordinary truth. The film deliberately slows its pace, allowing Linda Lee's new life to develop before the larger conflict fully erupts. In doing so, it reminds us that becoming a hero is often about understanding the world you're trying to protect. Midvale Academy provides that education in ways no Kryptonian mentor ever could. For someone raised within the serene order of Argo City, human social life feels wonderfully unpredictable. Conversations move faster than expected. Customs seem arbitrary. Small misunderstandings create surprisingly large consequences. Kara approaches each unfamiliar situation with complete sincerity, and that honesty becomes the source of much of the film's gentle humor. Unlike characters pretending to fit in through deception, Linda's awkwardness comes from genuine innocence. She isn't mocking human behavior, she's trying to understand it. These fish-out-of-water moments reveal another side of Helen Slater's performance. Rather than portraying Kara as emotionally detached because she's an alien, she emphasizes curiosity above all else. Every new friendship, every classroom interaction, and every confusing social expectation becomes another opportunity to observe humanity with fresh eyes. That perspective encourages audiences to appreciate everyday experiences often taken for granted. Through Kara, even ordinary school routines gain a quiet sense of discovery. Among the people who help anchor her new life is Lucy Lane. Their growing friendship introduces an emotional warmth that balances the increasingly supernatural events unfolding elsewhere. Lucy offers something Kara desperately needs: connection without expectation. She doesn't know she's spending time with a Kryptonian hero. She simply sees another young woman trying to find her place. That absence of judgment allows Kara to experience an authentic relationship built on trust rather than admiration. Symbolically, Lucy represents the ordinary life that every superhero risks sacrificing. Friendships like theirs remind viewers what is truly at stake whenever larger threats emerge. Saving the world matters because it contains people capable of kindness, loyalty, and compassion. Without those personal relationships, heroism becomes abstract. The film quietly understands that emotional investment begins with individual connections before expanding toward global responsibility. While Linda is learning how to belong, another transformation unfolds in complete opposition to her journey. Selena's possession of the omegahedron steadily reshapes both her confidence and her ambitions. At first, the object appears to fulfill long-held dreams of mastering authentic magic. Yet power has a way of altering desire itself. What begins as fascination gradually evolves into obsession. Each successful spell convinces Selena that greater achievements lie within reach, and every new demonstration of power makes restraint seem increasingly unnecessary. This psychological progression is one of the film's more intriguing ideas. Selena isn't satisfied simply because her abilities improve. Instead, each accomplishment expands her appetite for control. Power ceases to be a means of achieving personal goals and becomes the goal itself. The omegahedron magnifies more than magical potential. It amplifies the dangerous belief that possessing extraordinary abilities grants the right to reshape reality according to personal preference. That growing arrogance is reflected through the film's increasingly theatrical tone. Selena embraces dramatic gestures, elaborate rituals, and larger-than-life declarations that perfectly match the heightened fantasy world surrounding her. Modern audiences sometimes interpret this style as excessive, but within the context of 1980s fantasy cinema it serves an important purpose. Villains of this era often externalized their emotions rather than concealing them. Ambition, jealousy, vanity, and frustration became vivid performances instead of subtle psychological whispers. Selena's expanding megalomania therefore feels entirely consistent with the mythic atmosphere the film has chosen to create. Her ultimate objective also becomes unmistakably clear. The omegahedron is no longer merely a magical curiosity. It is the foundation upon which she imagines absolute domination. Instead of viewing the artifact as a responsibility, she sees it as proof that destiny favors those bold enough to seize it. The irony is striking. Kara crossed worlds to return the omegahedron to its rightful place and preserve an entire civilization. Selena intends to use the very same object to place the world beneath her own authority. Their conflict is therefore ideological long before it becomes physical. Amid these escalating ambitions, the film introduces one of its strangest narrative threads, the bizarre romantic entanglement centered on the groundskeeper Ethan. Love potions, misplaced affection, and magical interference transform ordinary attraction into chaotic comedy, creating a storyline that feels lifted directly from classic fairy tales. On paper, it appears almost absurd when compared with modern superhero storytelling. Yet this subplot reinforces the film's commitment to fantasy traditions rather than conventional comic book formulas. Magic here does not exist solely to destroy cities or summon monsters. It also distorts emotions, manipulates desire, and disrupts everyday life in unpredictable ways. The resulting love triangle becomes less about romance itself and more about the dangers of treating human feelings as objects to control. Selena's willingness to manipulate affection reflects her broader philosophy. To her, people are pieces to arrange, not individuals with independent choices. Even seemingly playful enchantments reveal an unsettling disregard for free will. Meanwhile, Kara's own understanding of responsibility continues to evolve. As opportunities arise to help others, she instinctively responds without hesitation. These early rescues may lack the scale of the climactic confrontations still to come, but they establish an essential pattern. Heroism is becoming second nature. She does not pause to calculate recognition or reward. Whenever someone needs help, action follows almost automatically. The transformation from curious visitor to active protector unfolds gradually, making her development feel earned rather than predetermined. These rescue sequences also highlight a subtle contrast in how power is portrayed. Kara's abilities create stability. She prevents accidents, protects strangers, and restores order whenever chaos threatens innocent lives. Selena's magic accomplishes the opposite. Every spell introduces greater unpredictability, expanding disorder instead of resolving it. The film repeatedly presents strength as morally neutral while emphasizing that intention determines its true impact. As these parallel journeys continue, the distance separating the two women steadily disappears. Kara still knows little about the mysterious force influencing events around her, while Selena remains unaware that the young woman adapting to life in Midvale possesses the greatest threat to her growing empire. Yet destiny is quietly arranging every encounter. The stolen omegahedron links their lives even before they recognize each other's existence, ensuring that the ordinary routines of school, friendship, and self-discovery cannot remain untouched by the darker magic gathering just beyond the edges of everyday life. Every hero reaches a moment when strength alone is no longer enough. Until this point, Kara's journey has followed the exhilarating rhythm of discovery. She has embraced a new world, uncovered extraordinary abilities, formed meaningful friendships, and slowly grown into the role of Earth's newest protector. But the true measure of a hero is never revealed during moments of effortless victory. It emerges only when hope disappears, confidence collapses, and every certainty that once defined them is stripped away. For Supergirl, that moment arrives with startling force, transforming the film from an adventurous fantasy into something unexpectedly introspective. Selena's confidence has now evolved into outright tyranny. Empowered by the omegahedron, she no longer experiments with magic simply to satisfy curiosity or personal ambition. She begins reshaping reality itself, treating supernatural forces as extensions of her own will. Every successful spell reinforces the illusion that she has become untouchable. The more resistance she encounters, the more determined she becomes to prove that no power, human or Kryptonian, can stand against her growing dominion. The escalation reaches a terrifying climax when Selena unleashes one of the film's most memorable creations, a colossal shadowy entity born from dark magic rather than science. Unlike the technological threats audiences associated with Superman's adventures, this creature feels ancient and primal. It doesn't merely attack with brute force. It embodies fear itself, moving like a living nightmare that has escaped from myth into reality. Its immense size, shifting form, and unnatural presence reinforce the film's commitment to fantasy, reminding viewers that Kara is fighting an enemy whose rules differ completely from anything her cousin had ever faced. The battle itself represents a dramatic tonal shift. Earlier rescue sequences emphasized excitement, optimism, and the thrill of discovering heroic potential. Here, those reassuring rhythms disappear. Kara's courage remains intact, but courage alone cannot compensate for an opponent empowered by forces she barely understands. Every attempt to overcome Selina's growing magic only reveals how dramatically the balance of power has changed. Then comes the film's emotional turning point. Rather than simply defeating Supergirl through physical confrontation, Selina banishes her into the Phantom Zone, removing her from the world she has only just begun to embrace. The decision is significant because it attacks far more than Kara's body. It isolates her from purpose itself. Instead of allowing the heroine another opportunity to fight, the story forces her into complete separation, replacing movement with stillness and hope with uncertainty. Visually, the Phantom Zone creates one of the strongest contrasts in the entire film. Argo City radiated warmth through luminous crystal architecture and harmonious design. Earth introduced vibrant colors, friendships, and endless possibility. The Phantom Zone rejects all of that. It stretches into an empty, desolate landscape where time seems almost meaningless. Light loses its comforting quality. Space feels endless rather than liberating. Every horizon appears lifeless, emphasizing isolation instead of wonder. The change in atmosphere communicates Kara's emotional state as effectively as any dialogue could. This is not merely another dangerous location. It is a physical manifestation of despair. Everything that defined her identity has been stripped away. Her mission has failed. The Omegahedron remains in Selina's possession. Earth is left defenseless against growing darkness. Even her extraordinary powers, the abilities that had come to symbolize her confidence, are gone. That final loss is perhaps the most devastating of all. Superhero stories often ask what happens when extraordinary individuals gain incredible abilities. Far fewer explore what remains after those abilities disappear. The Phantom Zone forces Kara to confront exactly that question. If she can no longer fly, no longer lift impossible weights, no longer protect anyone through superhuman strength, then who is she? The answer doesn't arrive immediately. Instead, the film allows Kara to experience genuine hopelessness. For the first time since leaving Argo City, uncertainty overwhelms optimism. The confident young woman who embraced every new challenge now questions whether she has failed everyone who believed in her. That emotional collapse gives surprising psychological depth to a film often remembered only for its fantasy spectacle. Failure is not presented as temporary inconvenience. It becomes an identity crisis. Within this bleak landscape, Kara encounters another familiar face, Zalter. Their reunion carries enormous emotional weight because neither character resembles the person introduced during the film's opening act. Kara has lost her confidence. Zalter has lost almost everything else. Exiled after his reckless misuse of the Omegahedron, he exists as a broken reminder of how good intentions can produce catastrophic consequences. The visionary whose curiosity once inspired Kara has become a man burdened by regret, living with the knowledge that his mistake endangered both Argo City and Earth. Their meeting quietly mirrors one another's emotional struggles. Kara believes she has failed because she could not complete her mission. Zalter believes he failed because his actions created the mission in the first place. Both carry guilt. Both question their worth. Yet together they discover something neither can find alone, the possibility of redemption. This relationship becomes one of the film's strongest thematic threads. Zalter no longer possesses the authority of a mentor speaking from certainty. Instead, he guides Kara through shared vulnerability. His wisdom now comes from experience rather than confidence. He understands that mistakes cannot be erased, but they can shape better choices moving forward. In helping Kara recover hope, he also begins reclaiming his own sense of purpose. The emotional climax of this sequence belongs not to another battle but to an act of sacrifice. Recognizing that Kara still represents the world's greatest chance against Selena, Zaltar chooses to give everything he has left to help her escape the Phantom Zone. It is an act of quiet redemption rather than dramatic spectacle. He cannot undo the accident that released the Omegahedron, but he can ensure that his final decision serves others instead of himself. The sacrifice transforms his entire character arc, replacing regret with responsibility at the moment it matters most. For Kara, Zaltar's choice becomes a powerful reminder that heroism is never defined by perfection. Even those who make terrible mistakes retain the capacity to perform extraordinary acts of courage. That realization restores something even more important than her lost powers. It restores her belief that failure is not the end of a journey unless someone chooses to stop moving forward. As the path back to Earth finally reveals itself, Kara steps toward it carrying far more than renewed determination. She returns with a deeper understanding of sacrifice, responsibility, and resilience, prepared to confront a darkness that can no longer be defeated by strength alone, but by the hard-earned conviction forged in the emptiness where even hope once seemed lost. When Kara emerges from the Phantom Zone, she is no longer the same young woman who eagerly crossed the boundary between worlds in search of the Omegahedron. The journey through failure has reshaped her understanding of heroism. Earlier, her confidence grew naturally from discovering extraordinary abilities. Now it comes from something far more enduring. She has faced defeat, experienced despair, witnessed sacrifice, and chosen to continue despite every reason to surrender. That quiet resilience becomes her greatest strength long before the final battle even begins. Earth, meanwhile, reflects the consequences of her absence. Selena's influence has expanded unchecked, and the magical power granted by the Omegahedron has transformed ambition into near absolute domination. What began as isolated acts of sorcery has evolved into a world increasingly bent around her will. The contrast between Kara's hopeful arrival on Earth and the atmosphere she now returns to is striking. Wonder has been replaced by unease. The vibrant promise of discovery now exists beneath the shadow of unchecked power. At the center of that darkness stands Selena's stronghold, transformed into something resembling an enchanted citadel rather than a conventional villain's headquarters. This setting perfectly captures the film's commitment to fantasy. Instead of futuristic laboratories or technological command centers, the climax unfolds within an environment shaped by supernatural energy, mystical symbolism, and constantly shifting magical forces. Every glowing surface and swirling spell reinforces the idea that Kara is confronting an entirely different kind of enemy than audiences had come to expect from the Superman universe. The Citadel itself almost behaves like a living extension of Selena's mind. Its unstable energy reflects her growing obsession with control, while its overwhelming scale illustrates how completely she has allowed power to consume her identity. Nothing about the environment feels stable or peaceful. Magic has ceased to be a tool and has become an uncontrollable force reshaping everything around it. In visual terms, the location represents the inevitable destination of ambition without restraint. The confrontation between Kara and Selena therefore carries meaning beyond the physical conflict unfolding on screen. Both women have been transformed by the same extraordinary artifact, yet each has traveled in opposite emotional directions. Kara's experiences have taught humility, compassion, and responsibility. Selena's growing mastery has produced arrogance, isolation, and an endless hunger for greater dominance. Their battle becomes a collision between two philosophies regarding the purpose of power itself. Rather than relying solely on overwhelming strength, Kara approaches the confrontation with a new sense of patience and clarity. Her time in the Phantom Zone has forced her to think beyond instinctive action. She understands that defeating Selena requires more than matching magical force with physical power. It demands understanding the weaknesses created by Selena's own obsession. The villain's greatest advantage has also become her greatest vulnerability. Believing herself invincible, Selena no longer recognizes the danger of the forces she commands. As their struggle intensifies, the Shadow Demon returns as a terrifying reminder of how far Selena's ambitions have expanded. The creature remains one of the film's most distinctive fantasy creations, embodying chaos in a form that seems almost impossible to defeat through conventional means. It towers over the battlefield like a living manifestation of corrupted desire, its presence reinforcing the central theme that darkness grows strongest when power escapes moral restraint. Yet Kara's greatest victory is psychological before it is physical. Instead of allowing fear or frustration to dictate her decisions, she remains focused on protecting others while searching for an opportunity to end the conflict without surrendering to the same recklessness that created it. This marks the completion of her emotional arc. The curious young woman who once relied primarily on courage has matured into a hero capable of balancing bravery with wisdom. That growth becomes crucial during the climax's defining moment. Selena's own magic generates an unstable vortex, a supernatural force intended to overwhelm every obstacle standing in her way. Earlier in the story, Kara might have confronted such overwhelming power directly. Now she recognizes a more intelligent solution. Rather than attempting to overpower the vortex, she turns Selena's own creation against its master. The sequence carries satisfying symbolic weight because the instrument of Selena's domination ultimately becomes the mechanism of her defeat. This reversal reinforces one of the film's recurring ideas. Evil often contains the seeds of its own destruction. Selena's refusal to respect limits has gradually made her dependent upon forces too dangerous for anyone to control indefinitely. By redirecting that uncontrollable energy, Kara allows Selena's obsession to consume itself. The victory belongs not to greater aggression but to greater understanding. As the vortex closes around Selena, the imagery evokes the same tragic irony that has followed her throughout the film. She spent every moment seeking absolute control, only to lose control entirely at the instant she believed triumph was inevitable. Sealed away by the very darkness she unleashed, Selena becomes another reminder that power pursued without wisdom inevitably isolates those who seek it. With the immediate danger finally ended, Kara reclaims the Omegahedron, completing the mission that first drew her away from Argo City. The glowing artifact once again becomes a symbol of hope rather than corruption. Its recovery represents more than the defeat of a villain. It signifies the restoration of balance between worlds. What was stolen through recklessness and nearly corrupted through ambition is finally returned through sacrifice and perseverance. The emotional rhythm of the film then shifts once more, exchanging spectacle for reflection. Kara's time on Earth has changed her in ways impossible to reverse. She arrived as a stranger searching for a missing power source. She leaves having discovered friendship, responsibility, heartbreak, and the true meaning of heroism. Earth was never simply the location of her adventure. It became the place where she learned who she was beyond the shadow of Superman and beyond the expectations of her own people. Her farewell therefore carries a quiet melancholy. The friendships she formed, the ordinary life she briefly experienced as Linda Lee, and the humanity she came to admire cannot accompany her home. Like many classic heroes, Kara understands that protecting a world does not always guarantee remaining within it. Some journeys end not with celebration but with acceptance that growth often requires letting go. When the Omegahedron is finally restored to Argos City, the luminous civilization springs back to life, its crystalline beauty once again glowing with renewed energy. The visual restoration mirrors Kara's own transformation. Both the city and its heroine have survived only because they endured loss before finding renewal. Argos City is no longer merely the sheltered home she left behind. It has become a reminder of everything her courage preserved. Looking back, the conclusion of Supergirl feels remarkably sincere. It resists cynicism in favor of optimism, suggesting that compassion ultimately proves stronger than ambition and that identity is earned through choices rather than inherited through legacy. Kara returns not as Superman's cousin, but as a hero whose greatest achievement was discovering that true strength has never depended solely on extraordinary powers, but on the willingness to carry hope across worlds, even when the journey demands everything in return. What ultimately separates Kara Zor-El from nearly every other cinematic superhero of her era isn't the ability to fly, lift impossible weights, or outrun danger. Those powers may define what she can do, but they never define who she is. Beneath the cape, Supergirl presents a heroine caught between two identities, each pulling her in opposite directions. She carries the legacy of Krypton, yet longs to experience the ordinary joys of humanity. She possesses incredible strength, yet approaches the world with remarkable innocence. That tension gives Kara an emotional complexity that is often overlooked whenever discussions focus exclusively on the film's visual effects or uneven reputation. One of the most fascinating aspects of her character is how fundamentally different her upbringing is from Superman's. Kal-El arrived on Earth as an infant and grew into adulthood surrounded by human values. By the time he embraced the Superman identity, his moral compass had already been shaped by decades of living among ordinary people. His extraordinary abilities were layered on top of an unmistakably human foundation. Kara's journey unfolds in reverse. She spends her formative years inside Argos City, immersed in Kryptonian culture, traditions, and expectations. Humanity is not the environment that shaped her childhood. It is something she encounters almost overnight. The result is a heroine who must simultaneously learn two things that most people experience separately: how to become an adult and how to become part of an entirely unfamiliar civilization. Every social interaction, cultural expectation, and emotional connection becomes another lesson in understanding a world she has never truly known. That difference dramatically alters the emotional rhythm of her story. Superman often appears composed because he understands both the people he protects and the society he inhabits. Kara begins with neither certainty. She is constantly observing, adapting, and asking questions. Her vulnerability is not rooted in physical weakness but in unfamiliarity. She possesses the power to save lives long before she fully understands the people whose lives she is protecting. This perspective also transforms Earth into more than a simple setting. Through Kara's eyes, ordinary experiences regain their sense of wonder. School hallways become places of discovery rather than routine. Friendships develop without preconceived expectations. Even simple conversations carry the excitement of cultural exploration. The audience isn't merely watching an alien hide among humans. They're witnessing someone genuinely trying to understand what makes humanity worth embracing. Of course, another challenge quietly follows Kara wherever she goes: comparison. Long before audiences meet her, the symbol she wears already belongs to one of cinema's most celebrated heroes. Whether spoken aloud or left unacknowledged, Superman's presence hangs over every stage of her journey. The comparison is unavoidable because Kara herself understands exactly who her cousin represents. She isn't stepping into an empty role. She is entering a legacy already associated with impossible standards. Psychologically, this creates one of the film's strongest themes. Living in the shadow of an extraordinary family member is an experience far more universal than flying through the sky. Many people know what it feels like to follow someone whose achievements seem impossible to match: a successful sibling, a gifted parent, a respected mentor, or anyone whose accomplishments become the measuring stick for everyone else. Expectations can become a burden before a person has the opportunity to discover their own identity. Kara's greatest internal struggle, therefore, isn't proving she can perform heroic feats. It is proving that she deserves to exist independently of someone else's legend. She doesn't reject Superman's example, nor does she attempt to replace it. Instead, she gradually learns that inspiration and imitation are entirely different things. True heroism requires authenticity, not duplication. Helen Slater understands this distinction remarkably well in her performance. Rather than borrowing Christopher Reeve's calm confidence or carefully echoing his mannerisms, she creates a heroine with an emotional rhythm all her own. Her Kara smiles more openly, reacts more spontaneously, and allows uncertainty to remain visible instead of hiding it beneath unwavering composure. Those choices make the character feel younger without making her immature. What makes Slater's portrayal particularly effective is its sincerity. Modern superhero performances often rely on irony, self-aware humor, or emotional detachment to create relatability. Slater chooses the opposite approach. She plays Kara with complete earnestness, embracing optimism without apology. That sincerity occasionally leaves the character emotionally exposed, but it also makes her compassion feel genuine. When Kara helps someone, it never appears motivated by obligation or reputation. She simply believes helping others is the right thing to do. Physically, Slater also captures an interesting balance between grace and strength. Her movements rarely emphasize brute force for its own sake. Whether flying, confronting danger, or simply moving through space, there is a noticeable elegance to the way she inhabits the role. That graceful quality reinforces the film's broader fantasy aesthetic. Kara often resembles a mythical guardian more than a conventional action hero, blending athletic confidence with an almost ethereal presence. Her performance becomes even more compelling when viewed through the lens of character development. At the beginning of the film, Kara still depends heavily on Zalter's guidance. Although her intentions are good, she has not yet developed the judgment necessary to navigate truly catastrophic situations independently. She possesses courage, but courage alone cannot replace experience. Like many young adults, she initially assumes that determination will always compensate for inexperience. The story steadily dismantles that assumption. Every major setback forces Kara to reconsider what heroism actually demands. Losing the Omegahedron teaches responsibility. Adjusting to Earth teaches empathy. The Phantom Zone teaches resilience. Zoltar's sacrifice teaches accountability. None of these lessons increase her physical power, yet each one strengthens her ability to make wiser decisions. By the time she returns for the final confrontation, her greatest transformation is invisible. She has learned to lead herself. This evolution explains why the climax feels emotionally satisfying. Kara doesn't win because she suddenly becomes stronger than Selena. She succeeds because she has become wiser than the frightened young woman who first left Argo City. Experience has replaced innocence without destroying compassion. Confidence has replaced dependence without creating arrogance. She still believes in hope, but now that hope is supported by hard-earned understanding instead of youthful optimism alone. Looking back, Kara's arc feels surprisingly modern. Contemporary superhero stories frequently emphasize emotional growth over invincibility, yet Supergirl was already exploring those ideas decades earlier. Beneath its fantasy imagery lies the story of a young woman discovering that identity cannot be inherited, borrowed, or imposed by family history. It must be earned through choices, shaped by failure, and ultimately defined by the courage to become something no comparison can ever fully measure. Every memorable superhero is ultimately defined by the opponent who forces them to reveal their true character. In Supergirl, that responsibility falls to Selena, one of the most unconventional antagonists ever introduced into early comic book cinema. She isn't a military conqueror commanding endless armies. She isn't a brilliant inventor constructing impossible machines. She isn't even driven by revenge against Krypton or personal history with the House of El. Instead, she enters the story as an ambitious sorceress whose greatest weaknesses are remarkably human: vanity, insecurity, envy, and an insatiable desire to control the world around her. Those qualities make her feel less like a traditional comic book mastermind and more like a fairy tale which suddenly handed limitless power. That distinction is crucial because Selena represents a dramatic departure from the villains audiences had come to expect within Superman's cinematic universe. Earlier films largely grounded their conflicts in science, technology, or criminal ambition. Even when plans became spectacular, they usually remained connected to recognizable human motivations expressed through rational means. Supergirl deliberately rejects that approach. By placing magic at the center of its conflict, the film changes not only the mechanics of the story but also the emotional language through which that story unfolds. Faye Dunaway embraces this shift without hesitation. Rather than attempting to restrain the material or force it toward realism, she fully commits to the heightened theatrical style that defines much of 1980s fantasy cinema. Her performance is grand, expressive, and unapologetically dramatic. Every glance, every spell, and every declaration feels intentionally larger than life, as though Selena understands she occupies a mythical world where emotions naturally expand beyond ordinary proportions. Viewed through a modern lens, this style is sometimes described simply as camp. While that description isn't entirely inaccurate, it often overlooks the purpose behind Dunaway's choices. Camp, at its best, is not accidental exaggeration. It is a deliberate form of heightened storytelling that embraces spectacle while remaining emotionally truthful to its own universe. Selena behaves like someone who believes she deserves absolute power because she genuinely cannot imagine a reality in which her desires should be denied. The theatricality therefore grows directly from her psychology rather than existing as empty performance. Beneath the extravagant gestures lies a surprisingly coherent portrait of narcissism. Selena is obsessed not merely with becoming powerful but with being admired, obeyed, and acknowledged as exceptional. Her ambitions continually expand because external validation never satisfies her for long. Every successful spell produces only temporary fulfillment before another, even greater desire emerges. Power becomes addictive precisely because it promises to fill an emotional void that cannot actually be solved through domination. The omegahedron accelerates that psychological process. Before discovering the Kryptonian artifact, Selena possesses ambition that exceeds her capabilities. She dreams of mastering authentic magic but remains limited by her circumstances. Once the omegahedron enters her possession, those limitations vanish almost instantly. What makes this transformation fascinating is that the object does not create her flaws. It simply removes the barriers preventing those flaws from shaping reality. This idea appears repeatedly throughout superhero fiction. Extraordinary power rarely changes someone's fundamental nature. Instead, it amplifies qualities already present beneath the surface. Kara becomes more compassionate because compassion already defines her character. Selena becomes more tyrannical because control has always been her deepest obsession. The omegahedron functions almost like a moral amplifier, revealing rather than inventing the personalities of those who wield it. Another reason Selena feels so distinctive is her complete separation from the archetypes dominating superhero films at the time. She is neither scientist nor soldier. Her authority comes through mysticism rather than technological mastery or physical force. That creative decision significantly broadens the kinds of conflicts Kara must confront. Super strength cannot simply punch its way through every obstacle when the enemy manipulates reality itself through enchantment, illusion, and supernatural influence. In many respects, Selena belongs to a lineage stretching back through centuries of folklore. She resembles the classic enchantress whose greatest weapon is temptation rather than brute violence. Magic allows her to distort emotions, influence relationships, and reshape perception, making psychological control just as important as physical confrontation. Even the bizarre love potion subplot reinforces this philosophy. Selena doesn't merely want victory. She wants the freedom to dictate how other people think, feel, and behave. That desire gradually evolves from personal ambition into global domination. At first glance, the escalation may seem sudden, yet it follows recognizable psychological patterns. Individuals consumed by absolute control rarely reach a point where they decide they have enough. Each success simply expands the scale of what they believe they deserve. Selena's ambitions grow because every victory convinces her that greater victories are inevitable. Without internal limits, external limits eventually become intolerable. The film also uses visual symbolism to reinforce her emotional decline. As Selena's magical influence expands, her surroundings become increasingly chaotic. Swirling energy, unstable environments, and supernatural distortions mirror a mind losing any distinction between personal desire and universal entitlement. She believes reality should conform to her wishes, and her magic literally attempts to reshape the world accordingly. The external chaos therefore reflects an equally chaotic inner life. Perhaps the most compelling way to understand Selena, however, is not as an isolated villain but as Kara's thematic opposite. The film repeatedly positions the two women as mirror images responding differently to similar opportunities. Both encounter the omegahedron. Both gain access to extraordinary power. Both possess enough determination to reshape the world around them. Yet every important decision they make leads them further apart. Kara consistently uses power to protect what already exists. Selena uses power to replace existing order with her own authority. Kara builds relationships founded on trust and empathy. Selena manipulates relationships through coercion and enchantment. Kara repeatedly sacrifices personal comfort for the well-being of others. Selena sacrifices everyone else's well-being to satisfy herself. Their conflict therefore extends far beyond hero versus villain. It becomes a philosophical debate over the purpose of strength itself. This contrast also explains why Selena never truly understands Kara. She interprets compassion as weakness because selfishness has become her only frame of reference. The possibility that someone might willingly risk everything for strangers seems irrational to her. Kara, meanwhile, cannot fully comprehend Selena's obsession with domination because protecting others feels infinitely more meaningful than ruling them. Their inability to understand each other's motivations deepens the emotional divide separating them throughout the film. In the end, Selena's downfall is less a punishment imposed from outside than the inevitable consequence of her own worldview. She seeks complete control over forces too immense for any individual to possess responsibly. Her refusal to recognize limits ultimately destroys the illusion of invincibility she has spent the entire story constructing. That tragedy gives the character an unexpected resonance. She is not defeated simply because good triumphs over evil. She is defeated because absolute selfishness inevitably consumes itself, while Kara's willingness to place others before herself allows hope to endure long after raw power has reached its limits. Although Supergirl is undeniably Kara Zor-El's story, the film quietly depends on its supporting characters to give that journey emotional weight. Superhero narratives often succeed or fail not because of the spectacle surrounding the protagonist, but because of the people who shape, challenge, and reflect that protagonist's growth. In Kara's case, nearly every important relationship represents a different stage of her transformation. Some remind her where she came from. Others teach her how to belong on Earth. A few even force her to confront failure in ways no superpower ever could. Together, they create the emotional framework that keeps the film connected to recognizable human experiences despite its increasingly fantastical world. Among these characters, none is more important than Zalter. Introduced as Kara's mentor within Argo City, he initially appears to fit the familiar role of the wise elder whose knowledge guides the young hero toward greatness. Yet Supergirl deliberately complicates that expectation. Zalter is intelligent, imaginative, and deeply committed to protecting his people, but he is also flawed in ways that fundamentally alter the course of the story. His confidence in his own judgment leads directly to the loss of the Omegahedron, making him both Kara's teacher and the accidental architect of the crisis she must solve. This duality gives Zalter unusual emotional depth. He is neither an infallible mentor nor a tragic villain. Instead, he occupies the far more relatable space between those extremes. His mistake is born not from malice but from overconfidence, a quality that has undone countless brilliant minds throughout history. By allowing one of its most respected figures to fail so dramatically, the film quietly rejects the comforting idea that wisdom guarantees perfect judgment. Experience may reduce mistakes, but it never eliminates the possibility of making them. Peter O'Toole brings considerable gravitas to this role. His theatrical background allows him to communicate authority without reducing Zalter to a distant, emotionless guide. Even in the film's earliest scenes, there is warmth beneath his confidence, suggesting genuine affection for Kara rather than detached mentorship. That emotional foundation becomes crucial once the consequences of his actions unfold. O'Toole never portrays guilt as loud or melodramatic. Instead, it settles over the character like an invisible weight, visible in restrained expressions and quiet moments of reflection. The Phantom Zone sequence ultimately transforms Zalter from mentor into one of the film's most poignant tragic figures. Exiled because of his failure, he exists as a living reminder that even noble intentions can produce devastating consequences. Yet the story refuses to leave him imprisoned within regret. His final sacrifice allows redemption to emerge not through apology alone, but through action. By helping Kara return to Earth despite knowing the cost, Zalter demonstrates one of the film's central beliefs: mistakes do not define a person forever. The choices made afterward matter even more. If Zalter represents Kara's connection to Krypton, Jimmy Olsen serves a very different purpose. His inclusion immediately signals that Supergirl exists within the broader cinematic world established by the Superman films. Rather than constructing an entirely isolated adventure, the filmmakers use familiar faces to reassure audiences that Kara belongs to the same universe as her legendary cousin, even if her story follows a dramatically different path. Jimmy's presence is subtle but significant. He carries with him the everyday optimism associated with Superman's world, reminding viewers that heroism is not sustained solely through extraordinary individuals. Ordinary people also contribute by documenting events, supporting one another, and believing in symbols greater than themselves. Because audiences already recognize Jimmy as someone closely connected to Superman, his interactions with Kara naturally reinforce her legitimacy without requiring constant verbal comparisons. Narratively, Jimmy also functions as a bridge between two storytelling styles. The Superman films often balance grand spectacle with lighthearted humanity, and Jimmy embodies that approachable perspective. He observes extraordinary events with curiosity rather than fear, helping preserve the sense of optimism that has always distinguished this cinematic universe from darker interpretations of superhero mythology. Equally important is Lucy Lane, whose role extends far beyond simple supporting companion. In many respects, Lucy anchors the emotional realism of Kara's experience on Earth. While spectacular battles and magical confrontations dominate the larger narrative, Lucy reminds both Kara and the audience that genuine relationships remain the true reason heroes choose to fight. The friendship between Linda Lee and Lucy feels refreshingly uncomplicated. There is no rivalry fueled by jealousy, no unnecessary betrayal manufactured for dramatic effect, and no constant competition for attention. Instead, the relationship grows through mutual kindness and shared everyday experiences. This may seem like a small detail, but it quietly distinguishes Supergirl from many stories that mistake interpersonal conflict for emotional depth. Lucy offers Kara something she cannot receive from anyone connected to Krypton: acceptance without expectation. She knows nothing about Kara's extraordinary origins or hidden responsibilities. She simply responds to Linda as another young woman navigating an unfamiliar environment. That absence of heroic expectations gives Kara a rare opportunity to experience normalcy, even if only temporarily. Their friendship also reinforces one of the film's recurring themes concerning identity. Linda Lee is not merely a disguise worn to protect Supergirl's secret. Through Lucy, Linda becomes a genuine part of Kara's emotional life. The alter ego gradually evolves beyond practical necessity into a meaningful expression of her growing connection with humanity. Rather than pretending to be human, Kara begins genuinely participating in human relationships, discovering that belonging depends less on biology than on empathy and trust. This emphasis on female friendship is especially noteworthy within the context of 1980s superhero cinema. At a time when many comic book adaptations focused almost exclusively on male relationships or romantic subplots, Supergirl devotes meaningful attention to supportive bonds between women. Lucy's presence helps ground the narrative, reminding viewers that emotional intimacy does not always require romance to feel significant. Even smaller supporting characters contribute to the film's broader thematic structure. Teachers, classmates, and ordinary citizens continually reinforce the contrast between Kara's extraordinary abilities and the everyday lives she seeks to protect. None of these individuals possess superpowers, yet their ordinary concerns give purpose to Kara's extraordinary gifts. Without them, heroism would become an abstract concept disconnected from human experience. What ultimately makes this ensemble effective is the way each character reflects a different aspect of Kara herself. Zalter embodies responsibility and the consequences of failure. Jimmy represents legacy and continuity within the larger Superman mythos. Lucy symbolizes belonging, friendship, and the ordinary life Kara briefly experiences. Even Selina, examined earlier, functions as Kara's moral opposite. Together, these relationships surround the protagonist with emotional mirrors, allowing different facets of her personality to emerge naturally through interaction rather than exposition. Looking back, Supergirl's supporting cast reveals an often overlooked strength of the film. They are not simply present to admire the heroine or move the plot forward. Each relationship contributes to Kara's gradual evolution from sheltered young Kryptonian into a selfless protector capable of carrying hope across two worlds. In doing so, they ensure that beneath the magical battles, glowing artifacts, and cosmic spectacle lies something far more enduring, a story about how the people who enter our lives ultimately shape the heroes we become. At first glance, Supergirl appears to be a colorful fantasy adventure built around magical artifacts, supernatural villains, and spectacular flights across the sky. Yet beneath that surface lies a surprisingly thoughtful exploration of identity. The film's lasting appeal doesn't come from its action sequences alone. It comes from the emotional questions quietly woven through Kara Zor-El's journey. Long before superhero stories regularly centered on personal growth, Supergirl asked what it means to discover yourself while living beneath the weight of someone else's legacy. The most obvious theme is coming of age, but the film approaches it from an unusual angle. Kara isn't simply growing older or learning how to use extraordinary abilities. She is leaving behind the only home she has ever known and entering a world that expects her to carry the reputation of a hero she can never truly become. Every step she takes is measured against the invisible presence of Superman. Even when his name isn't spoken, his legacy shapes the expectations surrounding her. That emotional burden feels remarkably universal. Many people understand what it means to follow someone whose achievements seem impossible to equal. It may be an accomplished parent, a successful sibling, a respected teacher, or any figure whose reputation becomes an unavoidable comparison. In those situations, the greatest challenge is rarely matching another person's success. It is discovering whether your own identity can exist independently of it. Kara's journey offers a quietly hopeful answer. She never rejects Superman's example, nor does she spend the story trying to surpass him. Instead, she gradually realizes that becoming a hero doesn't require copying another person's path. Inspiration and individuality are not opposites. They can exist together. By the film's conclusion, Kara earns respect not because she becomes another Superman, but because she embraces qualities that are uniquely her own: empathy, openness, curiosity, and unwavering compassion.